Hi, and welcome back, everyone. This is a brief summary of Teaching Talk 47, focused on classroom writing, challenges, and opportunities. And really, this is intended as a conversation starter for a longer conversation about challenges with writing. And I think most of us, in just about every subject that we teach, have some component of writing. Some subjects have them more than others. Obviously, in an English class, it's a primary focus. Social science is another one that has a lot of writing. But you'd be surprised to learn that so many other disciplines out there that maybe traditionally don't have a lot of writing have significant writing in their classes. So thus, I think it really warrants a conversation about some of the techniques and strategies we can take either as individuals teaching our classes, as a college, maybe perhaps part of, say, curriculum committee or the CLEMC group focused on enrollment management and learning, that we can strategize some ideas about how to expand services across the college. Even before COVID-19, there has been ample discussion about ways of giving really basic services to students. And certainly the focus on basic skills, English and math, has been a primary one ever since I've been at the college since the late 90s. It's even more significant now. And if you talk to your English colleagues out there, and welcome to Dr. Frank Cruz, by the way, our new English faculty hire. Congratulations. We're happy to have you on board. And I know certainly he and Julie and all the other great part-time faculty out there have spoken or will speak about these challenges and what they face in terms of trying to develop student writing that will allow the students to enroll in one of our classes, say for me in social sciences, and be better prepared to tackle complex argumentation. If you think about it, when you enroll in a social science class, we really want you to have that basic foundation of English writing such that you can then tackle the content. The content itself, the analytical, critical thinking stuff that goes on, the research skills, the theoretical skills, the methodologies that we ask for in the social sciences are themselves really challenging, not to mention then having to put all that in your own words. And this could apply to discussion posts. This could apply to full-fledged research papers with citations. I know in political science and history, they do a ton of this kind of writing. So, there's nothing really simple about thinking about the way that writing gets used in our classes, yet we want our students to feel comfortable enough that they can enroll in one of our classes and be well prepared to deal with the content and not hopefully have to worry so much about the mechanics of writing. But we know that's an ideal, and we've all dealt with challenges in our classes related to writing. In fact, quite a few years ago, I remember Michael Laughlin and others were part of a group. We were interested in this idea of writing across the curriculum, sharing strategies, collaborations across disciplines, to really send the message that it's not just on English faculty. I think we place so much pressure on English faculty to say, you're in charge of managing student writing. We're all in charge of managing student writing, and certainly communicational skills, as we'll get into at the next teaching talk, related to soft skills and a service economy industry in Lake Tahoe. Those kinds of skills really transfer quite well to thinking about writing. In fact, the article I sent out, which we'll take a look at here, in a sense, making an argument for writing plainly. And you could think about this as a faculty member writing in a discipline where you're publishing an article, a journal article, a chapter in a book, and you really want to convey your expertise, but do you feel forced to write in a very verbose or abstract way? It's one of the real challenges I think a lot of us probably dealt with in graduate school, where there often was an emphasis on expression in text, in writing, even in speech, that was very expository but very verbose, very much focused on abstraction. And this article is making the argument that we need to all write plainly or clearly, perhaps, is maybe a better way of saying it, if we expect our students to also appreciate forms of clear writing. Thinking about the audience is always key. So certainly when we're doing writing projects with our students, we could say, there's an audience to take into account. For example, if you're doing discussion posts in your class, it's super important to think of the audience. You're not writing on social media, so you need to use correct punctuation. You need to capitalize your I's. You need to make sure that you're not just, quickly jotting something down. And in fact, I tell my students that if discussion posts are full of huge grammatical errors or errors in spelling, I will deduct points. but not if it's just, a couple of mistakes here and there. And I usually apply that policy also to my papers. I want to keep in mind as I'm talking about this, you can always go to the LTCC Teaching and Learning.com website, and if you type a syllabus /syllabus, you can get some really good snippets for your class that include snippets about writing papers. And I think one of the things that's important initially in a class is to really clearly convey your expectations, not just in terms of grading and requirements, but your expectations in terms of papers and the formatting of them. And I'm just looking at some samples here. So for example, Treva says, writing assignments should be done with good writing practices, proofread and spell check materials prior to submitting and or posting to the discussion board. I include very similar statements in my class. I get very specific and say, you have to write, this is an example of one of those, 1-inch margins on all sides, double spaced, Times New Roman, Microsoft Word or PDF. Papers that do not fulfill requirements or follow requirements will not be accepted for credit in fulfilling the course assignments. So it's totally up to you as far as what rules you want to set. I know there's a conversation right now due to COVID that we should have more empathy for students. So certainly we should think about the language that we use talking about audience in communicating with our students and making sure that they follow the rules. So that's a very tricky matter and probably even warrants a future teaching talk in terms of the language that we use on our syllabus to convey information to our students where we want them to improve their behavior, but we're not so punitive that we're not being empathetic. So it's a really fine balance, and we've had a few conversations in our teaching talks on empathy, 2 or 3 that we've had over the last 2 years, about how challenging this is to do. So I don't assume that it's easy to convey or even possible to convey everything that you want in your syllabus to your students. So having a conversation, maybe a pre-meeting, or creating a video where you describe your writing assignments and your expectations could be one way to alleviate some of that fear that students have before writing that first paper. And it could also be an opportunity for you to really nip things in the bud, so to speak, and say, okay, I can really hope that by conveying all this to my students, they'll be better able to tackle their papers without making the silly mistakes, but common mistakes of grammar, spelling, punctuation, formatting that goes on in the paper, and so forth. And again, part of, I think, teaching in a discipline is conveying the disciplinary expectations in terms of writing. If I'm teaching a class, I'm not expecting my students to write at the level of a faculty member who's publishing in cultural anthropology or the American Anthropological Association's journals. But I do want them to know a citation style that's maybe common for my discipline, how to convey argument, how to tackle writing, and so forth. To that end, some time ago, I created this writing guide. And I stopped using it over the years, and I think in all honesty and being very transparent, I think I cut back on some of my longer paper assignments. I started to cut things into shorter assignments. When I first started teaching at the college, I had these really lengthy, they're called ethnographies in my cultural anthropology class. And we actually did workshopping, much like I've seen Michael O'Loughlin do in his classes, which can be very effective. So we all, the students in the class wrote drafts, and over different time periods, after every few weeks, like 3 or 4 weeks, I would collect their drafts, I would take their names off the papers and pass them around. And it was a pretty intense experience because even though it was anonymous, some of the students in the class were like, wow, this is really intense because people are commenting on my papers. And it tended to be the case that people were nicer because the expectation was, well, I want to be nice in conveying my comments and critiques in this workshopping group because I know my paper is also being workshopped. So it was kind of, in a sense, scratch my back, I'll scratch yours kind of thing. And it worked quite well, actually. But it did show them that the process of peer review, where people who are experts in your field, is a key part of doing writing in the social sciences. And so I would include this guide earlier on when I first started teaching at the college in the late 90s. It was something I included in my classes when I taught at the university. And I talked about things like grading and improving on your writing, how to start off thinking of writing as a process, different scenarios of how you might think about your audience, what's the context for the writing, who am I writing for, what do I know about the topic, and why am I writing. The occasion of writing, as we've discussed with that article just before, the audience, we all write for different people, the difference between an email and a class paper, the topic of the paper, and then getting into the mechanics of it. The main idea, assertions, organization, development, beginnings and endings, analysis, critical thinking, creativity, construction, paper length, presentation, and ending with the pleasure of the text. This is actually probably something I should revise and bring back to my class, because I think as I think back about this, teaching Anthro and Sociare for well over getting close to 25 years, I think that I probably need to bring back longer writing assignments and also maybe more of this focus on giving students a guide up front, and then also incorporating a tutorial, a video, or even a class session where we just sit down and talk about writing, because I think part of that is going to help convey the writing expectations in our classes. Again, the English faculty in their classes can teach everything about good mechanics and argument, and the 103 class, the research paper class, is certainly focused on a lot of the same things that I just cover in my writing guide. But when they take a class in psychology or sociology or political science or PE or art or even math, and they're asked to write, the expectations are going to be different. Years ago, I had a student I remember who, back in the early 2000s, took some physics classes, enrolled in one of my classes, and said, I'm not doing well in your papers, and I'm concerned because I would get an A in writing a physics paper, but in your class I'm getting a C or a D. And we had a pretty lengthy conversation about how the writing expectations differ from one discipline to the other. And it's really not about differences in grade or academic rigor, I explained to him. It's about style, stylistic issues, expectations in disciplines. And hopefully, as instructors, we can convey that to our students such that they can focus on being successful as students and not have to worry about doing rewrites if those are offered, or spending a lot of time reworking mechanics or trying to figure out the disciplinary expectations of writing in your class. So really, really, really complex matters overall. Now, the other thing that I do with my students is I try to show them samples of my own writing. So again, I can take them to my website, and a lot of my articles are available for free under this writing tab. And so I can share with my students some of the articles and books I published. We can talk about how to write for different audiences. And I often will use the example of, if I'm writing something like this, a heritage article written for Oxford University Press, a reader that was published years ago, I'm writing in a style that is maybe a little more academic and verbose. Hopefully it's still plain writing, as that article mentions. So if I'm writing for a more academic audience like this one with this handbook and heritage, there's going to be more jargon. There's going to be more technical terms. I can talk to my students about footnotes and how to reference things. I can also discuss about how you can maintain an argument like that article was talking about, but still write in a way that is relatively clear. And there's even pictures in this particular chapter, so it kind of expands hopefully on the learning and the understanding if someone is reading this particular chapter. So I would probably contrast something like that with a much different audience. So this was written for a more popular audience of designers in the leisure and entertainment industry, and for a book called Clad Book. And because this is a more industry-focused publication, I really wanted the verbose language and abstract language, theoretical language, to be reduced to a minimum, if not at all. And so if there are any technical terms, what I would express to my students is I try to then translate those into more everyday language. A lot more pictures, a lot more charts, and things that really kind of simplify thoughts to key structured points or even diagrams in the case of this particular diagram here. Doing a little field note journal entry, and I can show this to my students and say, this is how anthropologists think about writing field notes and translating field notes into writing. And again, anthropology is a very writing intensive discipline in terms of focusing on ethnography, and so it shares a lot in common really with literary criticism. And going back to my graduate program at Rice, some of the anthropologists involved in the late 80s were really trying to apply techniques of literary criticism to ethnographic writing and anthropology. So it's kind of influenced the way that I think about it. But in the case of talking about that, I would never address that, say, in this particular chapter in this book, because my audience is much different, and I'm trying to really think about things in a more simplified and even clearer process or mode of understanding, as you can see with these little charts that they put in and so forth. So, using our own writing, it could even be blog posts, it could be your own creative writing, it doesn't have to be publications, could be another way to really advance understandings in your class in terms of how your discipline thinks about writing, different from, with my example of physics, different from one discipline to the next. So I think that's always a great idea. And again, going back to that article, thinking about audience, thinking about improvement, writing as a process. I always talk to my students about having entire books rejected for publication, or articles or chapters. I can't count on my fingers how many things have been rejected, either in the abstract stage or even in the final written stage. And it's really demoralizing when you write and you have something rejected, and you maybe have an opportunity to improve on that, to do a draft and rewrite and so forth. And in today's day and age, on academia.edu, which is I think a pretty good place to read work, if you get a chance to look at academia.edu. One of the nice things is now they allow for drafts to be included. And so you could write a draft and you could send it to an audience. This is an example of something that came up on my reading list. And this is on Berlin. I've also written some work on Berlin. And so some of these will be opened up as drafts, and you can then, as a community, comment and give feedback to the author or authors. And I really like that. I like the fact that they're thinking of peer review, even in this process of not necessarily doing a final publication or review. And I have to say, I also talk to students about being a peer reviewer on many journals. I've reviewed entire books for presses. It gets challenging doing that. It takes a lot of time. In some cases you're compensated, very often you're not, or it's very low compensation. But expressing again to my students what peer review is as part of research is really important. And I tell them that when I review a book, a chapter, or a journal article for possible publication, I really am looking, to go back to this article, for some level of clarity. Obviously, if there's a lot of typos and grammatical errors, a reject or a please correct for the next version often gets sent to the author involved. But if something is not clear and it's full of very verbose language, that gets just really challenging to read. And so I definitely do think about audience. Any of the edited collections I've done, one of the real challenges is trying to make the authors, who are all writing from different disciplines, often different languages, spoken and written languages as a first or a second language. It's really hard to try to make those words and those arguments mesh with one another for a cohesive collection. It's one of the hardest things, is doing an edited collection, and I know a lot of universities don't count them for tenure review purposes, but they're really challenging because you have a lot to do in terms of correcting language, in terms of making the language appear more plain and simple to an audience of readers that maybe will not necessarily have the technical expertise of some of the authors who are writing in these volumes. So it's something else to think about in terms of the importance of addressing audience in all of our writing work. So certainly there are a lot of conversations that we could have as colleagues at our college to really think about ways of improving writing. And again, not putting all the emphasis on our English faculty to, if you will, fix all the problems or issues before the students take our classes, which could be social science classes or others. And I think, again, a challenge of this is we often say the advisory for this class is English 101. But in a lot of cases, because that is not a hard requirement, the student will enroll in a sociology or anthropology, political science, history, psychology class, and maybe not have the writing that they need to be successful in that class. So then we have to think of doing interventions as faculty members with the writing. The challenge with that is we have 11 or so weeks to work on just the content in our class, how do we find the time for writing? And that's why maybe some conversations come up about creative ways to create new curriculum. I could imagine a class like a smaller unit class that would be focused on writing in the social sciences. And it could be really an opportunity to give students a little bit of almost like that basic skills work that they do in English and math, where they have a little refresher course that's added onto one of the introductory classes to give them even more sense of scaffolding to help them out. So that could be an example of an opportunity, to create writing specific classes. For example, writing in the social sciences, kind of like as a 1 or 2 unit enrichment class. I don't know if that would work, if that would be a good idea, but it's one possibility. So before I jump into this, I should explain this chart, and this is really meant as an iterative document. So it's almost like one of those SWOT analysis, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats, but it's more focused on 3 areas of challenges, opportunities, and resources. So challenges would be, what are the things that we note in our writing, in our disciplines that we need to work on, or that really challenge students the minute they enter one of our classes. I'll use one of my discipline classes in anthropology. So certainly plagiarism, as we've talked about in the past, is always a challenge. Problems with basic writing, I think, is something, argument and the craft of writing, to be able to write effectively in your discipline, really could be a definite hurdle before students even, take your class for the first time. Sort of the fear of writing, I think, is another one. Just like fear of public speaking, fear of math, it can really stifle the student. Again, prior to them even enrolling in your class, they enroll and they say, "Oh my God, I have to do all this writing. This is going to be unbelievable. How am I going to do this?" And again, my concern is, if there isn't enough time in a class to give the one-on-one help, what then would we use as an opportunity or resource? So again, I think a writing-specific class could be an example of something in the social sciences. Another example, because I've been heavily involved in teaching the Promise classes, and I wrote the Promise curriculum and have been part of that whole Promise program since its inception, I think, is you could do more writing intensive stuff in the Promise class. Melanie Chu from the library does a really wonderful, it's basically an entire tutorial for the Promise students on how to do research in whatever discipline they're taking. And she goes through different sources of text, a blog post, a scientific journal article, a more popular publication like Time Magazine, and shows you the pitfalls of working with all those different sources. And I found like it was a really wonderful way to introduce students to the writing process as well as the research process. So other opportunities, I think certainly the library and more of their expertise in our classes, calling Melanie and the other folks in the library and saying, "Could you come and give a presentation?" That exact presentation on argumentation, the research process, so that my students could be better prepared to take the class and to really understand what my expectations are in terms of research and the subsequent writing. The Tutoring Center as well is a great resource for us that is probably underutilized in terms of tutoring, helping students with papers. These are previous students who graduated and took the classes and thus know a little bit about the writing expectations in those disciplines. So that could be another great opportunity. But I don't want to fill this whole thing out. So what I really want to do is challenge all of us, and I would like us to collaborate then on additional resources, opportunities, and challenges that we note in our classes. I think I could share this as a Google Doc. We could come back to it. We can do another teaching talk and really have conversations about how to really address some of the issues out there with writing in our classes, whatever discipline that we happen to teach in. So that's the summary here for Teaching Talk 47 on classroom writing. We'll be back with additional videos and conversations, of course, about this topic and many others. So thanks for listening, and I'll be back shortly with another video on additional topics related to this.